Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Jonathan, and merci, Hugo. I really appreciate the introduction. Thank you so much to the students who invited me. I was so honored to receive your invitation, and I was so happy to be here today. I was at another CIRMMT student symposium a couple of years ago as well, and I just remarked that the level of work that's happening here over many years is so high, and it's such rigorous interdisciplinary work, which is so, inspiring, I think, to see. I wanted to also thank the staff at CIRMMT, and special thanks to Isabelle Cossette as well for all the work that she's doing. And to my friends who are here, and I wanted to also thank Denise Lupien. She was my professor at McGill. She couldn't be here today, but I studied here for my undergrad and my master's. She was a big influence in my life, and we're still very close, but, and I'm dedicating this book to her, which I'm writing. And I'm going to give kind of a chapter from the book as my talk today. So this book is called Stereophonica. I feel bad for everyone who had to say that in the introduction, because it is a made-up word. But basically, after I did my studies here, I did a PhD in UC San Diego, and I was interested in sound installation art, the history of kind of experimental extended forms of sound sculpture. And I was interested especially in kind of analyzing these kinds of works through the realm of space, and we're more used to analyzing things as they unfold in relation to time in musical traditions. So I was really interested in, how are people thinking about conceptualizing space in relation to sound? We have all these terms which circulate in our contemporary discourses in musicology and sound studies, things like acoustic space, soundscape, acoustic environment, acoustic territory. The list goes on, really. And I wondered, what is the kind of history? We don't have as much in terms of the kind of historical knowledge about where some of these ideas come from. What is auditory perspective? How were people thinking about this in, the 19th century and also before that as well? So I was kind of curious about that, and that's what my book is trying to do. And so I'm tackling quite a few topics in that book. I start around 1850. It'll make sense in the talk, because this is around the time that people are starting to systematically study auditory space perception and spatial hearing for the first time, and I'll talk a little bit about some of those studies. I'm also interested in early stereo and binaural technologies, which I know some of you must work in spatial audio, and you're doing, things with like VR acoustics and ambisonics and wave field synthesis. There were also, of course, stereo technologies actually in the 19th century, and I look into some of those. Today's talk is going to be on the third chapter of the book, which is on acoustic defense, acoustic location, locating, basically machines of war through listening during the First World War. And from that, I look at some other phenomena. Each chapter is kind of like a cut into a historical moment in which ideas about sound and space changed to see how they fit together. Otherwise, you can have a history of acoustics or a history of sound engineering or a history of music and sound art. I'm trying to kind of make some links across these. So I look at things like stereo reproduction and binaural reproduction, also things like electroacoustic music and sound installation art. And Jonathan mentioned that I'm the director of a research group called Recomposing the City. I'm also interested in sound in urban environments. So the book is looking at quite a wide range of concepts in relation to sound and space. So we can maybe come back to some of that later, but I'd like to get right into it now. So we're all familiar with the concepts of monaural audition and binaural audition, hearing with one or two ears. But for many centuries, from the early modern period really into the early 19th century, it was really the single ear that was under scrutiny in Western medicine and, say, science, philosophy. Hearing was studied as a one-eared phenomenon, and it was the anatomy and the physiology of the single ear that people were studying. This term binaural is introduced in 1861 by a British physician called Somerville Scott Allison, who created this differential, what he called the differential stethoscope. There had been a binaural stethoscope invented in 1851 and then commercialized in 1852, the one that had the two earpieces, binaural. He added a second trumpet, kind of sound collector. And he called it the differential stethoscope, and he started writing about differential modes of auscultation, so listening to two sounds at the same time, and it's an early actual form of stereo listening. You're listening to kind of two channels, it's not an electrical signal, but you're listening to two sounds simultaneously in both ears. So this term, binaural audition, scientists start to study it much more rigorously, and it's associated with what we today call spatial hearing, so sensing the direction, the distance, the location of sounds. The person who coins the term stereophonic is Alexander Graham Bell, who in 1876 patents the telephone, and then he's curious about, can you tell the direction of sounds through the telephone when you're talking on the telephone and listening on the telephone? It's a new device, and they haven't been using it yet. So he did a very extensive kind of series of experiments where they had different auditors in different rooms. They were using different kinds of transmitters and receivers, listening while blindfolded, listening with one ear closed. Anyhow, he determined actually you can't tell the distance or direction of sounds, but in the process of these experiments, which is published as Experiments Relating to Binaural Audition, he coins the term stereophonic. And what he says is there seems to be a one-sidedness about sounds received through a single ear, as there is about objects perceived by one eye. But when both ears are employed simultaneously, sounds assume a solidity, which was not perceptible so far as one ear was employed. So that term solidity, solid, that's this Greek stereos, and that's where that term stereo comes from. So what he observed actually was a stereoscopic, what he called a stereoscopic effect of audition. So he was using a visual, optical term having to do with binocular vision, viewing in 3 dimensions. And a lot of 19th century scientists actually who were looking at acoustical phenomena were relying on optical phenomena to first explain these phenomena. And so he was looking at Wheatstone's stereoscope, invented by Charles Wheatstone in the course of his studies on binocular vision. And what the stereoscope did, it was a very popular device in the 19th century for reproducing photographs. But you would look at 2 photographic images, through this stereoscope, and it would appear to be a single 3-dimensional image. And this was a very popular mode of image consumption. And he said that he predicted that his telephone would one day be used to reproduce the stereophonic phenomena of binaural audition, so these effects of hearing in 3 dimensions. And he was correct, because the very next year, in 1881, the French engineer Clément Ader invents this Tapaphone, which is exhibited at the Paris Exhibition of Electricity in 1881, and it's using the Bell telephone, and it's a stereo broadcasting system. It's transmitting live performances of opera, theater, and music from telephone transmitters at the foot of a stage to 2 telephone receivers, and people are listening in stereo. And journalists who are talking about it start to describe this phenomenon of auditory perspective. And it was marketed as Electrophone in Paris and France, and it was marketed as, Tapaphone and Electrophone in England. And here's an Electrophone user from 1901. She looks like she could be a Montreal hipster, I think, pretty much. But yeah, and they were listening in a kind of there was a weak kind of stereo effect. It was kind of a quasi-stereo kind of effect. So around this time, this image is from 1892, this study of auditory space perception and what is this auditory perspective and how are we sensing sounds in relation to space starts to become a very kind of, serious inquiry in science. And this is a German psychologist called Hugo Munsterberg who's seated in this chair apparatus, which was called the rotating chair apparatus, at the Harvard Psychological Lab, which he founded. And he was doing experiments there with a group of scientists, but including one of his students, Arthur Henry Pierce, who ends up writing one of the most kind of extensive studies of auditory space perception around this time. And what Pierce says in opening this book is, he says, for the psychologist who's attempting to analyze the matter of space perception, there must be assuredly a full recognition of the existence of spaces. Among the various spaces that have been overtly recognized, visual space, tactile space, etc., it is only too evident that an auditory space has not generally been included. And he says, one cannot express an exclamation of surprise at finding so widespread a denial to hearing of all independent participation in a world of space. So in 1901, it was actually quite controversial, this idea that auditory space, that we could even sense space through sound, or that it functioned independently meaning of the senses of vision and touch, the visual space and tactile space. So I'm going to tell you, I'll review quickly what people believed. So some people thought that there were, physical limitations, either with sound itself, the ontology of sound, the physical nature of sound, let's say, and what sound could do, or physiological limitations of the ear and hearing. So some people believed that the ear itself did not possess enough surface to represent spatial relations of the external world, but that it could only perceive positions in each moment. Others believed that sound was unable to relay space attributes. Some people thought that, yes, you can sense auditory space, but it's only an intellectual construct. It's a construct of the mind. That the direction of sounds is perceptible only insofar as reasoning is applied. So it's something that your mind is constructing, but not your ears. Other people believe that it's a byproduct of other modes of sense perception. So that, for example, by tactile and muscular exercises, our auditory sensation complexes are localized in a space already constructed by the activity of eye, muscles, and skin. So this one German psychologist, Theodor Lipps, he says, the notion that we hear tones in the distance or out of the distance is like the notion that we immediately see things soft or hard. Distance is no possible object of hearing. So this was actually like it sounds strange to us today. We're so used to kind of thinking about sound now in spatial terms, but this was the kind of prevalent view at the time. And what Munsterberg and Pierce did was they ran a series of experiments in this rotating chair apparatus in which they placed telephones on these circular rims around the listener. The listener's head is in there. And they kind of do these short bursts of sound. They move the telephones around. They move them like up and down. They increase the intensity. They're kind of doing like a systematic mapping then of auditory space perception. How are people, what is the normal sense of sensing space? So they had 12 subjects. All of them were familiar with this rig, and they would guess the direction of the sound. And they come to a kind of interesting conclusion through these experiments. Pierce's argument, what he ends up saying, is that we can prove that auditory space perception exists, and that it exists independently of the senses of space, touch and vision, because of this one kind of sound that people started to localize inside their own heads. So people started to say, I can hear sound in my head, kind of like near the front, like inside, and their eyes are closed, they're blindfolded. And so they say, if you can localize a sound inside the space of your own head, well, you can't see inside the space of your own head, and you can't touch inside the space of your own head. So it must be the case that we have an independent kind of perceptual faculty, which is auditory space perception. That's kind of how they proved that. And I just, as an aside, if you're interested in kind of experiencing this phenomenon of intracranial or endocephalic sounds, they're also called, this is a nice album by a wonderful Austrian sound artist called Bernhard Leitner called Kopfraum, or headscapes. And you hear these kind of like lines and points of sound moving. It's almost like sound sculptures for the space inside your head, as though your head was like an empty volume. So that kind of idea has been exploited by artists as well in the 20th century. Now, Pierce said that even though auditory space perception exists, it's nevertheless secondary to visual space perception. If somebody was trying to locate themselves in space through hearing, it would be like finding yourself in a hall of mirrors, and you would never know where to go because you would never know whither to turn. Sound is always liable to be reflected. And so that was the logic, okay? So this kind of auditory space perception is kind of a secondary or subordinate, let's say, to visual space perception as an object of inquiry. Well, that changes suddenly when these things come, well, literally, I guess, on the horizon during the First World War. Here's an account from 1922 from A.V. Hill, who's a Cambridge-based physiologist, who runs this experimental anti-aircraft section for the British Army during the First World War. He says, the necessity for sound locators arose when night bombing by aircraft became a serious menace. It became imperative to devise means first locating, then attacking raiding aircraft. So that's what I'm going to basically call acoustic defense, or you could think of it as acoustic location, tracking the enemy by listening to it. And that is a very obvious kind of idea to us now, but it was not that obvious in 1914. So from another contemporaneous account, this is also by a British lieutenant, and he says, our enemies were seeking safety for their attack principally by rendering their airships as far as possible invisible, by taking advantage of the protection of clouds. The main problem, therefore, which presented itself to the guns of the defense was, how were we to effectively hit an object which we could not see? The answer is childishly simple, namely that though we can't see it, yet we can hear it. Therefore, as we cannot aim by using our eyes, we shall be obliged to shoot by using our ears to aim with. And he himself says, this sounds extremely simple when you know it, but there was a long time before theory, however correct, could be turned into practice. So my talk, and this chapter, is kind of on how theory was turned into practice during the First World War. And I'm particularly interested in acoustic sound locators that required human auditors, that were subjective forms of listening to sound spatially. And I'm interested in these national contexts of the birth of acoustic defense in Britain, in France, and in the United States. And there are other accounts I would point you towards Roland Wittge's The Age of Electroacoustics from 2016 also he writes a lot about the German role in sound location. But so I'm going to focus on the kind of allied forces today. So I want to look at technologies of listening that were invented to do this, but also the new modes of listening that they inspired, and then think about, why was this important for how we understand sound and audition. This is from a report from the US Assistant Secretary of War and Director of Munitions, Benedict Crowell. He commissioned this report after the First World War. It was called America's Munitions. And in it, you can get the sense of how almost fantastical or supernatural it seemed to be able to kind of do this spatial hearing. They write, in childhood, we were enthralled by the tales of those magic persons whose keen hearing could detect even the whisper of the growing grass. As camouflage developed, modern warfare yearned for such supernatural gifts of sense that troops might detect the unseen presence of the enemy. Accordingly, science, the fairy godmother of today's soldiers, raised her wand, and lo, the army was equipped with the wonderful ears of the fairy tale. Uncanny no longer, but a concrete manufacturing proposition. So that seems like a kind of wild, take on it, but it wasn't entirely an exaggeration, because experiments in sound and audition grew exponentially as a result of the war. In the 19th century, studies in acoustics were relatively small scale, relatively occasional. They were carried out by individual scientists and individual laboratories. But during the war, there were countless kinds of experiments on sound and acoustics. These experiments were generously resourced. They were urgently done, and there was communication at the national and international level as well, especially amongst the Allied forces who were communicating about sound and acoustic defense, and we can read their reports, and I'm going to look at some of that. In France, the acoustic defense came under the purview of this military section on radio telegraphy, and that was under the command of General Gustave Auguste Ferrier, who was a very well-known military officer as well as an engineer, radio engineer, who had collaborated once with Marconi, and who you can go to France and go to the Ferrier Museum today. So he was the one who was in charge of this kind of research in France. In France, there were many kind of prominent scientists who were brought on board, who were corralled into the war effort to participate in acoustic defense research. So, for example, René Bayot, I hope I'm not massacring that, he was an astronomer, he was a physicist, and he invented this device, which we are probably quite familiar with now, this acoustic paraboloid, this acoustic reflector, the Bayot paraboloid, and he was an astronomer, and he was also thinking about an optical correlation, an analogy in optics. So he was actually inspired by the Newtonian telescope and the concave and convex lenses of the Newtonian telescope in creating this lens, which was, focusing sound at its, point. Jean-Baptiste Perrin was also involved in acoustic defense research in France. He was the person who invented this amazing machine called the Perrin telesight-meter. And he was a future Nobel laureate. There were also many famous, now scientists involved in the German project as well. But what they said about France was, it may be the ease with which the French scientist could travel between his laboratory in Paris and the front line that had something to do with the way in which sound ranging, I'm not talking about sound ranging today, it was a kind of way of artillery ranging, but about how that developed in the French army. Now, in Paris, you had many observatories and laboratories collaborating, and it was, imperative to protect the French capital, especially from air raids, and that's why a lot of this research is happening in Paris. He said the Frenchman could always fix something up in his laboratory, and if he could interest any of the authorities in his experiments, they could roll up and see for themselves what he was doing. And we do have photographs of, French military leaders going to these kind of acoustic defense research sites and looking at these technologies that we'll see now. In the United States, it was the Signal Corps, which was the division in charge of this kind of thing. Now, at the beginning of the war, the Signal Corps was established during the US Civil War, but at the beginning of the First World War, it was a very small division, and it's in charge of military telecommunications and communications. There was only 11 officers and 10 soldiers in the Signal Corps at the outset of the war. Well, that's not going to do much good, basically. So the person who was in charge, who was the kind of chief signal officer, Major General George Owen Squire, that name might be familiar to you because he was the inventor of Muzak. After the war, he established wired music, what was first called wired music, and then which became Muzak. We're gonna not talk about that right now, but he wrote a letter to US industry leaders, basically asking them to come on board and bring this kind of industrial research arm into this effort. And very quickly, the Signal Corps grew through this civilian reserve. And by 1917, there were over 53,000 men in the US Signal Corps, and many of them were engineers at places like AT&T, Western Electric. In England, it was, there were two kind of military divisions in charge of acoustic location and acoustic defense research. One was under the Munitions Inventions Department. That's where A.B. Hill was running this section, the anti-aircraft experimental section. And there was also another parallel group called the Acoustical Research Section. Now, I went to the Science Museum, which there is one in London you can visit. That's the kind of public one. And then they also have an archive, which is in Rotten, which is in the middle of nowhere. You can't take public transportation. You have to like go with the car because it's like going to the X-Files. You have to drive and drive and drive, and it's just like fields and fields and fields. And then suddenly there's like these massive hangars in the middle of nowhere. And that's where they store a lot of these old technologies. They even have old trains and airplanes and things like that. But it's also a wonderful library. And you can actually see a lot of these military communications, which are now unclassified. And if we look at those reports, we find reference to many, many different kinds of acoustic technologies that were used by the MID. So, for example, tube resonators, Helmholtz resonators, turntable resonators, these things, which were sound locating trumpets. You can read that, but maybe I should read it. Carbon microphones, magnetophones, the hot wire microphone, which was invented in order to, it was a kind of microphone that only responded to gun reports, and so that was used in artillery ranging. Amplifying sets, ear defenders, which were like kind of ear protectors. The war was very loud. Sound plotting devices, so imaging devices for sound. And these weird things called listening wells, where they put these things called listening discs. And they were thinking, you have an acoustical image, almost like the Arago spot in optics at the center of these two listening discs. So they were doing wild experiments with many different kinds of technologies. And those technologies were also going through many different kinds of design modifications very quickly. So for example, René Bayot, he's actually the one on the left, and then that's a soldier on the right. You can see the soldier is listening with a stethoscope at the kind of point of greatest focus of the wooden paraboloid. But this first paraboloid was only about 60 centimeters in diameter. And that wasn't large enough to reflect the low-frequency sounds emitted by the Gotha airplanes. So it was the exhaust note, really, that they were trying to follow in the airplane. So it got bigger, basically. And you can see already and they're rotating it as well. So they start to be able to rotate it along an axis. It's not only one, but it's then two people who are going to be listening together. I'll talk about that in a moment, but you can see how quickly it developed. This is in 1 year. And at the side of it, you can even see this altitraceur automatic, this kind of course plotter, automatic course plotter. Here's another bioparaboloid. Here are some more. Here we see a different kind of shape for the paraboloid bowl. This is an American model. The American model is clearly lighter. It's more practicable for mobile warfare. Another American model. So they're doing all of these kinds of design modifications, testing, and they're also inventing many different technologies, some of them which work and some of them which don't really. And which also kind of use different ideas in terms of how it is that we're sensing sound. In the very early years, they were actually thinking about things really related to seeing sound. This was one technology called the lunette acoustique, which was invented by a French soldier, George Sagnac. And it was essentially, it was like you were supposed to put your ears at these two, it looks almost like binoculars, right, for the ears. This other one, which is kind of wild, which was called the viseur acoustique, or an acoustic sight. And what they were, so they know that binaural audition, requires for you to be sensing the intensity of sound at the two ears and the difference in phase. But what they did was, they said, if you can see your ears equally in this plane mirror, then the compass will tell you where the sound is. Now, that doesn't really work, right? But it's an experimental technology along the way. Yeah, I won't read that whole long quote, but that's basically what they got at. They're also sensing sound, which is being, in this case, transduced from physical motion into sound. So you remember that differential stethoscope, Scott Somerville Allison's differential stethoscope with the two trumpets. Clearly, this technology is like a derivative of that. So this is the Geophone. It's a French invention. Some people think it was Ferrier. It's not totally well established who invented it, but it was invented in 1915 in France. And it's essentially a variation on the differential stethoscope, but it's replacing those trumpets of the stethoscope with these small seismographs, which are transducing vibrations of the earth through things like mining operations into sound. And so the auditor is listening by putting those seismographs on the floor or the walls of a subterranean chamber. And once he hears the sound equally in the two ears and he's looking at that line, that's how he tells where the sound is. An expert auditor could discriminate between different kinds of sounds, like blows of the pick, boring, scraping, but also as those sounds were modified by different kinds of terrain, like sand and chalk. They could detect movement from up to 100 feet and directionality as well. Now, this technology, it looks quite primitive in a way, but it was so effective that it rendered mining operations obsolete. So what Sir Lawrence Bragg wrote about this process was he could turn the geophones into new positions on the floor until the sound was equally heard in the two ears. He would then know the direction of the enemy, and they called that the binaural principle. Now, they also knew that interaural time difference and phase difference are involved in spatial hearing, the time at which the sound wave arrives at the two ears and the difference in phase. So Hill in 1922 is referencing the study by Lord Rayleigh from 1907, which is the kind of most authoritative study on the direction of sound. And he says, if a sound is heard in such a way that there's a difference in phase between the trains of waves between the two ears, a sense of direction is produced. This head-mounted apparatus that you're seeing in the picture, that's another technology that was used along the way. This is in Lord Rayleigh's experiments from 1907. They would bow two tuning forks with a violin bow continuously, and the subject would hear sometimes cancellations and phase, so they were studying it with this technology. Now, in order to increase the distance between the two ears, how do you do that in order to then increase the, let's say, interaural time difference and make that sense of direction more, sensitive? Well, in 1879, in the United States, this was an invention called the Tapaphone by Alfred Marshall Meyer, and what he was doing was, this was a technology that was used by ships that were navigating in fog. But some of the World War I technologies have a similar kind of basis. So this one on the left side is called the Wertbostel, and it's a German invention from 1915, invented by someone who was actually a musicologist, who then also was studying acoustic location during the war. So two psychologists, who one of them was also a musicologist. And then the Claude orthophone, which is a French invention, similarly, you can see it's extending that distance between the two ears. But as you can see, the Claude orthophone doesn't actually have trumpets, so it's not collecting a lot of sound, it's not amplifying necessarily that sound, so they need to also amplify it. So here's a kind of later iteration of this, which is called the double trumpet sound locator. And it's using conical horns to collect sound. And it's both using interaural time difference as well as the binaural principle. In order to determine direction using sound locators like this, the listeners would equalize the sound at both ears. That was called bracketing the sound. That's how they described it. And as you can see, there's not one, but two people listening. There's that one guy, and there's one other guy right there. So one of those pairs of trumpets is used to determine the horizontal bearing of the airplane, or the azimuth, and the other is used to determine the altitude or its elevation. So that's called an alt-azimuth mounting, and you could say essentially that they were engaged in a kind of double binaural listening then, because they were two listening at the same time using this kind of binaural principle. But one of them was only listening to altitude, one of them was only listening to azimuth, and they were reporting, what they heard. Okay, so let's see what this looks like in action. We actually have video from the interwar period from 1930s. This one is, it's an American group of soldiers who are doing this drill, and they're going to test this sound locator. So you can already see it's very heavy. These are not light or kind of super mobile instruments. So I think it's, requiring something like 6 men, or maybe there's even more, to take it off that transport truck. It's occupying that whole transport truck too. They put it on this, what they called a turntable, the thing on the wheels, and then they can start to rotate it and use it. And then it's always used in conjunction with a searchlight, which is then going to beam a powerful, beam of light once they think they know where the airplane is. And I have one more video, actually, which is now showing a kind of different model, the T2. I don't know if we could lower the lights maybe just for this, but sorry, I should have asked that before. That's my fault. But this will go on for about 2 minutes or so. And I mean, as you can see, he's really strapped in there. The auditor is not, they're not going anywhere, basically. And they're also, the way that this helmet, is designed is also to protect the ears because it was so loud as well. Okay, so they're sending this information to the acoustical corrector. Corrections are added for the travel of sound, wind, and other atmospheric conditions, which of course alter the propagation of sound, so they have to make adjustments for that every time they're using this technology. And then they're sending that to the searchlight crew. Okay, so then at night, under the cover of darkness, the airplane approaches and is tracked by the sound locator. It's happening in the dark, and once they start putting the searchlights on it, then they start trying to shoot down the airplane, basically. Okay. So I'm going to just leave it at that for the video, but just to say, military auditors, listeners, they weren't listening in, a laboratory setting, of course. They're listening in these very chaotic conditions of warfare. We don't have any sound recordings of battle during the First World War. There have been some recreations, which are terrifying to listen to. But we know that what Martin Daughtry has called the bellophonic soundscape, the soundscape that was, only came into existence because of warfare, was a very extreme one. We know that by, what people wrote and said about it. And there were also reports of instantaneous deafness. There were reports of ear bleeding and other kinds of trauma to the ears. And listeners became very quickly fatigued as well when they were listening through these sound locators. So they start doing tests as well on listener fatigue. They find that even the best listeners, the ones who have the best acoustic aimings, can only maintain that sense for about 19 minutes. And then they go so off course that they just can't, they're not useful basically anymore. So they are training these soldiers to listen and to use these technologies. And they establish in France these écoles d'écoute in several towns near Paris. This one is at Duny. And you can see all these bioparaboloids in the field. They're also a kind of reserve for these massive technologies. Here's another image of a école d'écoute, where Allied soldiers, not only French, are sent to get training on these technologies. We know a little bit about how they were trained through military manuals. This one was from a French manual that was translated into English on the acoustic goniometer, which is that device over there. The listening exercises were done in 5 stages. In the first stage, there was a fixed source of sound, which was about 100 meters away from the listener. The assistant claps, or they sound a trumpet, and then the assistant moves sideways. The auditor is adjusting the device. If their acoustic aimings are deviating too much, then they're out, and they don't get to become one of these military listeners. Now, the vast majority of people basically are gone at that stage. They're not listening directionally very well. In the second stage, the assistant is mimicking a moving sound source and is moving. And then the third and fourth stage, the auditor is following the sounds of an airplane, the direction and then the elevation. And then in the fifth stage, the 2 auditors are doing this together. So directional listening is kind of starting to become understood as a skill that can be developed through ear training. And they say that auditors should be trained every day systematically, otherwise they will quickly lose their efficiency. So that's quite interesting too, that they were training them so consistently. Now, I just want to show you one more of these, which is the Perrin telesite meter, maybe one of the most complex acoustic sound locators. And his question really was, how can you increase the amplification of those, conical horns, let's say, but not the size of the machine? And so he creates this thing that he calls a myriaphone, which is this multicellular horn assemblage. They're clustered together in these kinds of honeycomb type patterns. And this device apparently is, the French, at least, they adopted as standard towards the end of the war. There's different, again, models. There was one with just the 2 myriaphones, and then there's one with 4 myriaphones. And they also use it along with acoustic plotters. They create acoustic charts, and so they're doing imaging techniques as well. So I'm going to wrap up. I think we're coming towards the end. So why is this important? Why do we care about it? Well, first of all, there's a practical advantage to being able to use these kinds of technologies, but it's also changing acoustic and auditory science. I think it's also reconfiguring how people conceive of conceptualized listening, as well as how they think about sound. First of all, it's this kind of disciplining of the listener. We have in the 19th century the rise of the binaural listener. People are doing these scientific tests. They're reporting their subjective sense impressions of listening in three-dimensional space, but they're doing it in these kind of medical and scientific contexts. So there's kind of a disciplining of the listener that's also happening in the 19th century through auditory space perception like science. In the First World War, that listener becomes militarized, and they're doing this very highly codified, systematic kind of listening. And listening changes. We think of listening as this kind of continuous act, which is carried out by individuals in everyday contexts. It's this, simple kind of thing that we just do every day, or, people who are listening. But during the war, it becomes this very complex kind of act, which is also fragmented into all of these parts, and it's carried out by groups of people. It's this other idea of listening as well as data collection. They're not listening for the meaning of sounds. They're listening essentially to report physical acoustical data. So the military auditor is kind of like a human acoustic sensor. They're almost doing a kind of machine listening, but they're doing it as humans. If they had computers, of course, at the time, they would have used those. And they did have some objective methods as well, but they also use these subjective methods. It inspires new modes of listening and spatial hearing. So this kind of double binaural listening, let's say, or that mode of listening with the geophones. And there's an article that I would point you to by David Bloor, which is looking at these kinds of collaborative and cooperative modes of listening in relation to kind of social group identity. He's a sociologist, but he's looking at it through the lens of these acoustic locators. Listening is, again, and not only thought of in the sense of hearing sound, but in acoustic sensing. So acoustic defense is making acoustic energy increasingly audible, as well as through imaging techniques visible. Now, in 1914, sound is most commonly defined as the effect produced upon the auditory nerve by certain vibratory motions. But during the war, that definition isn't always applicable. So Hill says, sometimes we have to consider the propagation of sound without reference to its ultimate detection by the ear. So it also furthers this definition of sound as a vibratory motion of matter of the type of which the organ of hearing responds. So it's making concrete this idea that sound is sensible kind of energy and not just what you hear. It also changes how people are thinking about acoustic space and auditory space. As I said in the beginning of the talk, before the war, auditory space is considered this kind of secondary space relative to visual space. But during the war, it emerges as this vital space, which is surveilled, scrutinized to this kind of extraordinary degree, which had never happened before, essentially in human history. And powers of hearing are mapped out onto the actual powers of nation states. It also changes how people think about directional listening. So in the 19th century, it's studied as in terms of human physiology and psychology. And now directional listening is understood as a kind of tactical activity. It's just something that can determine human survival, even national survival. And finally, acoustic location makes concrete this idea that sound travels. So again, for the first time in human history, thousands of auditors are orienting themselves not towards only the visible source of sound, but to the path of sound. And through those orientations, you could say that they reoriented history itself. So, thank you.